Hello and welcome to my review of the final season of Ozark, the hit Netflix crime drama that just wrapped the second part of its fourth season. I have a review for you today filled with spoilers, so make sure if you haven't finished the series, go watch it. I definitely recommend that you do, and then come back so you can hear my thoughts on what I think is one of the best series in recent memory that ended pretty spectacularly. The role of a finale is often an impossible task to actualize because what the show is doing is not only wrapping up the storylines that you've been following for some time, but in many ways, the finale determines the ultimate purpose of the show. The thesis that is an undercurrent for everything that you've been watching up to this point, that the writers have always had in their minds, finally is played to the audience. So it's a very hard task to create a rather sublime final season and final episode. But I think Ozark does a pretty fantastic job at that. Now, I've been a fan of this show for 2 years now. I caught up with the first 3 seasons amid the pandemic. How this show explored class, age, and gender in the arenas of power and family, I think is quite possibly its greatest attribute. There were so many complexities to these characters. No one character was narrowed to just represent one specific identity. There were depths and there were contradictions within these people that I really loved that made them feel real. They didn't feel like they were just serving the purpose of the writer. They were allowed to be human. They were allowed to make decisions where in one moment you're rooting for them and then the next moment you're cursing them out. There's a lot of suspense and tension because you're constantly asking who's in control. I really loved when the directors of these episodes decided who's talking and who's in focus. You would have characters reacting to what was happening and they would be the focus of the shot. And this constant seesaw within scenes determining the focus of the frame, it allowed us a introspection into these people's lives. More is said in the reaction of these characters than their actual actions. And that's, again, a really interesting choice for a show that's so plot heavy. There are many times when you could just give up on the characters. You could just think that what they're doing is so terrible. I mean, there are so many decisions that are made where the characters are just making such awful choices and hurting so many people, but you still are invested. David Chase talked about this with The Sopranos when he got so many people saying he should have killed Tony Soprano in the final episode. He's like, you know, he might not have done great things, but don't tell me that you wanted to see him dead or you would have stopped watching a long time ago. You cared about his story, which is why you were watching. And I think the same could be said about Ozark. I cared about these characters despite their awfulness, and I could see the lightness, the hope in these characters' eyes. Now, I think this series will be remembered for its female representation, especially in terms of representing women in power. What I really loved seeing was that the women were not afraid in this show to make the decisions that their male counterparts have made in the past and that they could make, but in television's history, they've never been allowed the opportunity to make. It was great to see the female characters really take ownership and define this show in many ways. Ruth Langmore and Wendy Bird, as portrayed by Julia Garner and Laura Linney, respectively, just crafted such interesting and fantastic characters in the pantheon of not only women in television, but just television in general. The characters that they were able to create, all of the layers, were just fascinating to watch, and you were just on bated breath with every single line they delivered. Just mastery work on behalf of those two. There were many times when I was watching this series, and this season in particular, where I was getting flashbacks to Daenerys, especially in this scene of the third to last episode of the show. And this is how the episode ends, which was very similar to how the third to last episode of Game of Thrones ends. There's definitely a longer conversation to be had in terms of comparing Daenerys and Wendy Bird, and you could even throw in Skylar White as portrayed by Anna Gunn on Breaking Bad. Survival just has many faces, and for the women in this show, they were able to take the reins and really give this perception and this viewpoint that is unique to the crime drama, even beyond television. You look at some of the staples of this genre in film, The Godfather or The Irishman, you can start to see that women's stories in those narratives are discarded, but that's not the case with Ozark, and I think that's why this show really excels to the degree that it does. And by the time we get to the end, there are just such bold choices being made here that reward the story over rewarding the audiences. And this is where your final warning, spoilers amok. With the death of Ruth Langmore, that definitely has the potential to upset audiences. And I've already seen that, many people were turned off by the show because of the death of Ruth. In a way, it kind of just makes perfect sense that that's how this story would end. This story has always been about how the birds will sacrifice anybody and will hurt anyone to preserve themselves. And that's made abundantly clear in the incredible final scene where Mel is saying the Cokes and he's naming all these big brands and say, you guys don't get to win. And then Wendy goes, since when?
You don't get to win. You don't get to be the Cokes or the Kennedys or whatever fucking royalty you people think you are. World doesn't work like that.
Since when?
These are who the birds are. You may have been rooting for them, but they always cared about themselves. And Ruth is a representative of the fact that the lower class was always going to pay the price for the higher class. And the average person will not know the ins and outs of every decision that's made. And things will cut to black without complete closure in our minds. But if you're really following the show, I think you know exactly how it ends, because the show told you. These are the people who win because they're willing to sacrifice anything to win. There are a lot of structural choices also that I think are pretty daring. At first, there was a certain lull because I kind of figured that Camilla was behind a lot of the goings on. And so I was waiting the episode and a half for Marty and Wendy to catch up with that. But I realized that because they start this second half of the final season with the death of Javi, the show kind of breaks down every single component and then builds it back up again. And because of that, you get this rush that builds in those last couple of episodes as all the moving pieces are just arriving at their end point. I also loved how the show brought a lot of the things full circle. I really loved the return of Rachel. I thought that was really great. I always loved that character, and I really loved how she integrated into the final episodes. I really liked seeing Ruth take control. I always saw her as a mix of Marty and Wendy. And to see how she was operating in these final episodes with Rachel, it made her story even a lot more sad because this was such a tragic character. And I think that her death doesn't diminish her story. I think her death is kind of how I think that story should have ended, because we see a lot of potential in Ruth, that she was able to claw her way out of so much abuse and so much, emotional stress. And yet when she's about to get on top, she's taken down. The people who have power will never allow somebody like Ruth to have power. They'll never let somebody with low class or comes from a low class family. They'll never allow her to pull herself out of that stature. She'll always have to stay there. And I love that's why she dies at her home in her trailers by the Ozarks. Her character was so prophetic in that way. And I really appreciate the bravery that the creative team had to not reward the audience, to reward the story. Because in the end, that is what is more important here, the story that you're telling. Because when I got to that final scene, it just perfectly clicked. Every single thing that they were establishing just worked. The cast, of course, this is one of the best casts of television history. Jason Bateman, Laura Linney, Julia Garner. Their ability to give humanity to such despicable characters truly made them such titans of their craft. And I also really loved a lot of the supporting characters. I loved bringing in Camilla, Navarro's brother and Javi's mother, because again, it brings it in that dynamic of the women in power. For a second, I was like, why are we introducing Camilla right after we introduced Javi in season 4, part 1? It seems like do we really need all these different characters? But it made sense because then Camilla really brings the whole thematic center to this exploration of women in power. I love that. I really love the kids. And I loved how this show explored age in terms of claiming your power and your independence. That was really great with Jonah and his rebelliousness in season 4, especially in the second half. And then also Charlotte, who has a different approach to that because she's a little bit older. The age dynamics of this show was also one that I think took a lot of bravery, because to put kids in these situations is not usually the norm. Usually they're on the outside, or they're part of the wallpaper of the background. But here they're front and center, and I really appreciate that. And of course, one of the later additions to the show was Wendy's family. You know, we got it with the incredible Tom Pelphrey in season 3, and then her father comes in this season. And I think this is one of the most honest portrayals of family abuse that we've seen, because it shows the darkness. It doesn't try to sugarcoat it. You know, when Wendy is pleading with her father on her knees at the courthouse because he's going to take her kids away, there's just such despair. Be it family, religion, wealth, location, we all vie for association. And I think what happens is when we get older, we realize that we just lie to ourselves. We trick ourselves into believing that association is enough to get by. The great scene of when Jason Bateman is punching that guy in the car, which was directed by Laura Linney, that 4th episode, or I guess the 11th episode of this season, was just, she did a fantastic job. I mean, Jason Bateman won an Emmy for directing this show, but Laura Linney, I believe this is like the first thing she directed. So great. It was so pathetic the way he was punching that guy, and then the camera follows him as he walks off, because you see that Marty has tricked himself into thinking, oh, I'm doing this for my family. Oh, there's a way out. And there's never a way out. And I think that's when he's realizing it. Nothing is done in passing in Ozark. They commit to every single story point. And that's why I really respect this finale, because it shows that they weren't going to expound on this. They weren't going to, drudge into monotony and become redundant. This is where this story's natural conclusion arose, and I really respect that they were able to, in my opinion, perfectly land a fantastic ending to a fantastic series. So that's my review of Ozark Season 4 Part 2. Let me know if you're a fan of the show. What did you think of the ending? Let me know in the comments below, and make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to not miss any new videos from Spoilers Ahead with Anthony Post. Thank you all so much, and I'll see you at the movies.